Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. In the UK, September was not the only change in season that we witnessed. We also saw a season of change in being the first time ever that all key offices in the British Cabinet were occupied by people of colour. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, and even the International Trade Secretary and President of the Board. And now, at the time of this podcast, number 10 itself, the top job of Prime Minister. As the heat began to rise in June and we experienced record temperatures, the star of one particular Prime Minister fell into decline, and a contest began in search of a new Conservative Party leader, attracting a range of talent from various ethnicities and backgrounds. The change of tone that happened across the UK as a result of 7 decades of intense migration had also gradually taken place in the House of Commons and to some extent the House of Lords. After seeing the results of the third and fourth Tory leadership contests to take place in the last 6 years, I began to reflect on the significance of a political party that may be traditionally perceived by some as being prejudiced and elitist in its beliefs, but was, at present, becoming more diverse in its appearance. There has been an ethnic representation at number 10 before, in the form of Benjamin Disraeli, the son of a Jewish Italian writer. Disraeli experienced an English upbringing and took office on 2 separate occasions during the reign of Queen Victoria. His first in 1868 and then from 1874 to 1880. Disraeli is the only Jewish Prime Minister to date, and it was a timely appointment as the ban on Jewish representation in Parliament was only lifted a decade earlier in 1858. It was Disraeli who proclaimed Queen Victoria as Empress of India in 1877. Jumping forward into the 20th century and then looking back at the irony of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech made 100 years after Disraeli's first time in office, has Disraeli's time in office and his achievements been forgotten? In 1968, Powell's speech expressed the opinion that it was unthinkable for a person of any ethnicity other than English and white that could be elected to a constituency, let alone walk the corridors of power at number 10. As the words invasion and immigration begin to trend on social media and enter the national dialogue once again, I began to focus my learning journey on finding out more about the origins of the UK Parliament and how the country used its legislative and political powers to secure, maintain and dismantle its empire across the globe. The origins of the UK Parliament lay within the body of people known as the Witan, a group of barons, landowners and clergymen all elected by the king to advise him on matters of taxation and political interests. As well as the Witan, there was also another process operating at a more local level called moots, where bishops, lords, sheriffs and prominent local people would assemble to represent the views of the population in their shires. The Magna Carta signed in the first formal body recognised as Parliament in 1215, and by 1254 shires were able to send elected representatives. By 1265, nobles and bishops attended, and 2 elected representatives from counties and towns became the model for modern-day Parliament and is commemorated as Simon de Montfort's Parliament, named after the nobleman who established this structure. Noblemen and bishops made up the House of Lords, and the knights became collectively known as the House of Commons. By the late 1300s, Parliament began to pass its first laws on taxation and voted to depose Richard II, allowing Henry IV to ascend to the throne. Parliament's role and capacity grew steadily, and by 1414 consultation with both the Lords and the Commons were necessary in order to pass new laws. The 1500s saw harmony between Parliament and the monarch, with the break from Rome and the Catholic Church, but also turbulence in the relationship when the issues of freedom of speech and freedom of religion were raised, sometimes at the cost of the imprisonment of individual MPs. More turbulence brought civil war in the 1650s and saw Parliament abolish the monarchy, only to reinstate it a decade later, passing the Test Act to disallow Catholics from holding elected office, and by the end of the Stuart era, established protocols for royal succession in declaring George of Hanover as George I. At the beginning of the 20th century, women fought for and won the right to vote and serve as elected members. The House of Commons was given greater powers and now totals 650 members. Today, the current monarch, King Charles III, serves as Parliament's ceremonial head of state, while the Prime Minister serves as head of the executive branch. From my perspective, the UK's ability to build and maintain a global empire happened through a threefold process. Firstly, through the development of the Royal Navy, established through Henry VIII's break with Rome, but came to prominence during the reign of George II. The Navy became a formidable force, and 1759 saw the start of England's domination of the seas, waging war against other colonial powers such as France and Spain in order to acquire and protect its newly formed colonies in Canada, the Caribbean and Americas. The second element that helped the UK to build its empire was the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1840, where the slave trade saw its peak and decline as individual merchants and traders accumulated enormous wealth. These merchants established companies that were sometimes so powerful that they not only transformed minor shipping ports, such as Glasgow, into industrialised cities at home, but also used trading activities to colonise other parts of the world, such as the British East India Company and its dominance and trade monopoly over the Indian subcontinent. And thirdly, this newfound wealth and corporate structure has a profound impact upon British society to this very day, with the rise of a new political class who used Parliament as a vehicle to pass legislature for practices that transformed a group of overseas countries used haphazardly for trading activities into possessions of the UK government and finally the Crown. These legislations established a precedence over the course of hundreds of years, becoming an integral part of the UK's economic and financial structure. A structure that is measured, controlled, and premeditated for the purpose of protecting assets, retaining wealth, and preserving legacies obtained from empire and the colonial era. A structure that has become difficult to challenge or change. But where does the timeline of empire actually begin for British legislation? England's use of Parliament to build its empire could have possibly begun when Parliament passed the Navigation Acts, particularly in 1660 to 63, during the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. These were key pieces of legislation. Why? The Acts of Trade and Navigation, as they are collectively known, began from around 1651 and became a series of laws which sought to regulate all shipping and trade activities by other European powers within and across England's colonies, and required all goods and produce from its colonies to be transported in English sea vessels. Think about how significant that was on a global scale. Parliament legislation also used treaties to acquire overseas territory, such as the 1763 Peace of Paris, which not only brought the 7 Years' War with France to an end, but enabled England to acquire Quebec, the French West Indian Islands, and Senegal. And also in 1815, the Peace of Vienna ended the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and England acquired the Cape of Good Hope, Mauritius, Tobago, St. Lucia, and Guyana. And it didn't stop there. The British Ultimatum of 1890 secured the southern Central African lands of Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia from the Portuguese, settling a dispute about land ownership in the aftermath of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. Once a territory was annexed, legislation was passed to secure the control of the indigenous ethnic groups within the territory. For example, colonial Kenya's settlement societies was a good example of this. Established in 1902 under British plans to use Kenyan land and labour to raise capital for the Uganda Rail project, native Kenyans were encouraged to become wage labourers. However, this land expropriation caused many issues for the Kikuyu, Maasai and Nandi people, as their pre-colonial migration patterns as herders, farmers, fishers and hunter-gatherers, which they had been for centuries, had now been disrupted and lost. Living in settlement societies caused isolation within tribes and overcrowding, as well as discouraging economic autonomy, as natives were forbidden to grow their own crops, undermining African farming. The Masters and Servants Ordinance, passed in 1906, and the introduction of identity passes was another common approach adopted by Britain across several of the colonies it occupied. Parliament did not only pass legislation to annex territories, but also to unionise them. The 1902 Treaty of Vereeniging asserted British sovereignty over both the Transvaal and Orange Free State, with both states later becoming unified under the South African Union Act in 1909. Legislature also acted to unify territories closer to home, with the 1707 Acts of Union between the Parliaments of England and Scotland, unifying Scotland with England and Wales, evolving into the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And this was further extended in 1920 with the Government of Ireland Act, partitioning Ireland, creating a state called Northern Ireland as a part of Great Britain, evolving into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. UK Parliament legislation also recognised the right to self-governance and granted independence in colonies where occupation was predominated by British settlers, such as the 1783 Peace of Paris, Treaty of Versailles, which ended the War of American Independence, recognising the autonomy of the United States of America. In 1847, North American provinces, such as Nova Scotia, set up responsible self-government, and in 1850, the Australia Colonies Government Act established responsible self-government in almost all Australian colonies and then New Zealand from 1852. This was further recognised with the Australian Constitutions Act, effective from 1901. From the North American provinces in 1847, it took a further century for Parliament to recognise the independence of other colonies, which were predominantly ethnic. The 1947 Indian Independence Act was followed a decade later with a cascade of legislation for other ethnic colonies such as Ghana, Jamaica, Malta, Botswana, Mauritius, Swaziland and Fiji, which all had their independence confirmed through parliamentary statute between 1957 to 1970. And finally, let's look at Parliament's legislature in the form of facilitating race relations and migration post-independence and post-Windrush. Back in 1948, freedom of movement across the empire was available to everyone living in British colonies. But this legislation evolved and changed as time went on. It has been long implied that the Commonwealth Immigrants Act 1968, the Immigration Act of 1971 and the British Nationality Act of 1981 were enacted on the premise that the migration of many ethnic groups from Britain's colonies changed the face of Britain, which gradually began to assume a darker hue, and therefore many felt that migration to the UK needed to be reviewed and controlled. Jumping forward into the 21st century, just as we can look back on Enoch Powell's speech with irony, should we also be looking back at the irony of all these post-colonial immigration laws and what their implied purpose was? Have the decades of achievements and contributions of Caribbean, Asian, African and European migrants within the UK been forgotten? In spite of this, while legislature by the UK Parliament may well be at work to deny many people access to its shores, and as the words invasion and immigration begin to trend on social media and international dialogue once again, surely the greatest irony of all is that after 4 centuries of legislation which sought to control foreign territories, it has now not only become thinkable, but possible for a person of colour to occupy the highest office on British soil. If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform and check out my other podcast episodes related to this one, such as A Change of Tone, an alternative history for H.M. Windrush from Season 2, and Long to Reign Over Us, the prelude, and Long to Reign Over Us, the main act, also from the 2nd season. Both episodes commemorating the Platinum Jubilee. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They're all available on the website in both Kindle and paperback formats. And also the publication of the latest 4 titles. If you want to find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. Sadly, the draw for a free copy of Aspiring Authors magazine for Black History 2022 has come to an end, but the winner for the final month of October was not announced due to October's podcast episodes being occupied with my interview by the wonderful Miss Angela Thomas-Smith to celebrate the start of the 3rd season of the podcast. Can you believe it? How time flies. So, without further delay, I'd like to say congratulations to my final winner, Jane. A copy of Aspiring Authors is on its way to you. I'm also excited to announce more news. My learning programme that I created as part of the diverse curriculum for the London Borough of Hackney has been accepted. It's called Let's Go for a Walk and introduces children and young people to the importance of using historical walks in their local area to uncover the presence of African and Caribbean individuals of the past. The lesson sequence and activities will be available on Hackney's diverse curriculum website very soon. Please look out for it. And if you want to hear an audio version of the learning programme, just visit my second season of the podcast and listen to the episodes Let's Go for a Walk Parts 1 and 2 and my analysis and reflection of the programme in the follow-up episode Let's Talk About the Walk. In fact, I'm forgetting my manners. If this is your first time listening, welcome. It's lovely to have you on board. Please visit storiestobetold.com and register for your free samples of my first 4 titles, and you can opt in to our email list if you wish. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click on to whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. And as always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. Because history is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next